The morning sun was just beginning to warm the steps of the Lincoln County Courthouse when Judge Marcus Wilson arrived. It was a Tuesday in May, the kind of spring day that promised summer's heat, but hadn't quite delivered it yet. At 58 years old, Judge Wilson carried himself with the quiet dignity that came from 3 decades in the legal profession. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed, and his dark suit was pressed perfectly, as it always was. Judge Wilson had been on the bench for 12 years now. He was the third black judge ever appointed in the county's history, a fact that filled him with both pride and a sense of responsibility. The leather briefcase he carried contained notes for today's important case, a complex land dispute that had divided the community along uncomfortable lines. "Morning, Judge," called Mrs. Pearson, the elderly clerk who had worked at the courthouse since before Judge Wilson had passed the bar exam. He smiled and waved, his mind already running through the arguments he expected to hear that day. The courthouse had recently implemented new security measures. Metal detectors had been installed at the main entrance, and 4 new security officers had been hired. The changes came after a threat assessment recommended upgrades to the aging building's safety protocols. As Judge Wilson approached the employee's entrance, the same door he had used every workday for the past 12 years, he noticed 2 officers he didn't recognize. Both were white men in their 30s, with the stiff posture of people new to their authority. "Good morning," Judge Wilson said with a polite nod, reaching for his ID badge. "This entrance is for authorized personnel only," said the taller officer, not moving from his position blocking the doorway. Judge Wilson smiled patiently. "Yes, I understand. I'm Judge Wilson. I'm presiding in Courtroom C today." He held out his courthouse ID badge. The officer glanced at it briefly, but didn't step aside. "We'll need additional verification." By now, several other courthouse employees had gathered behind Judge Wilson. Among them was Judge Patricia Sullivan, a white woman who had been appointed to the bench the same year as Wilson. "Is there a problem?" she asked, stepping forward. "Just a security check, ma'am," the second officer said, immediately stepping aside to let her pass. "Go right ahead, Judge Sullivan." Judge Wilson noticed how quickly they recognized her, despite her not showing any identification. He also noticed how the ma'am became Judge Sullivan in the span of seconds. "My colleague is Judge Wilson," Judge Sullivan said firmly. "We have a meeting before court begins." The officers exchanged glances. "We have a new protocol," the first one insisted. "We need to call upstairs for verification for anyone we don't recognize." By now, a small crowd had gathered. 2 attorneys, the court reporter, and several members of the public watched the scene unfold. Judge Wilson felt his heart rate increase slightly, though his expression remained calm. In his mind, he was calculating options, considering the impact of each possible response. "I see," he said quietly, looking at the time. Court would begin in 30 minutes. The land dispute case had already been delayed twice. 6 families were waiting for resolution. They deserved justice without further delays. What happened next would stun everyone present, including the officers who had created this unnecessary confrontation. Judge Wilson's response would not only resolve the immediate situation, but would spark a conversation that would transform the courthouse culture forever. Instead of raising his voice or demanding to speak to a supervisor, Judge Wilson did something unexpected. He took a step back from the door and glanced at his watch again. "I understand you're doing your job," he said to the officers, his voice steady and measured. "But I have a courtroom full of people waiting for justice today. How about this? Why don't you both escort me to my chambers? That way, you can verify my identity with the chief judge along the way." The officers looked at each other, unsure how to respond to this reasonable suggestion. Before they could answer, District Attorney Sarah Johnson approached the entrance. "What's the holdup?" she asked, her briefcase tucked under her arm. When she saw Judge Wilson standing outside with the officers, her eyebrows shot up in surprise. "These officers are following new security protocols," Judge Wilson explained calmly. "They don't recognize me and need verification." "That's ridiculous," Day Johnson said. "Judge Wilson has been on the bench for over a decade." By now, several more courthouse employees had gathered, including Court Administrator Robert Phillips, who pushed his way to the front of the small crowd. "Officers Stevens and Burrows," Phillips said, addressing the security guards by name. "This is Judge Marcus Wilson. He presides in Courtroom C." Officer Stevens shifted uncomfortably. We have new protocols, sir. We need to verify. I saw you let Judge Sullivan in without verification just now, Phillips interrupted, and Judge Parker walked in right before her. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Wilson noticed a young black law clerk watching from the sidelines, her eyes wide with disappointment but not surprise. In that moment, he made a decision about how to handle this situation. Gentlemen, Judge Wilson said to the officers, I believe we have an opportunity here. Everyone fell silent, waiting to hear what he would say next. I'm going to ask you both to walk with me today, he continued. Not just to verify my identity, but to sit in my courtroom. I'd like you to observe the proceedings. The officers looked confused. You see, Judge Wilson explained, justice isn't just about following protocols. It's about recognizing humanity in everyone who walks through these doors, rich or poor, known or unknown. Officer Burrows, the younger of the two, had the decency to look embarrassed. Sir, we didn't mean any. I know, Judge Wilson interrupted gently, but intent and impact are two different things. Today, your actions have delayed justice for the families waiting in my courtroom. Judge Sullivan, who had come back outside when she realized Judge Wilson wasn't following, stepped forward. Marcus, do you want me to call the chief judge? She asked. Judge Wilson shook his head. No need, Patricia. These officers are going to accompany me today. We're going to turn this into a learning experience. To everyone's surprise, Judge Wilson then extended his hand to Officer Stevens. After a moment's hesitation, the officer shook it. My father was a security guard at a department store for 30 years, Judge Wilson said. He taught me that doing a job well means using both your head and your heart. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, many of them whispering about what they had just witnessed. Judge Wilson's response wasn't anger or even indignation. It was an invitation to understand. As they walked through the courthouse hallways together, Judge Wilson asked the officers about their backgrounds, their training, and their understanding of the legal system. With each question, he was building a bridge rather than a wall. The day was just beginning, but the story of what happened at the courthouse entrance was already spreading through the building. No one could have predicted what would happen next. As Judge Wilson walked through the courthouse with Officers Stevens and Burrows flanking him, people stopped to stare. It was an unusual sight. A judge being escorted by security officers who had just denied him entry. But instead of awkward silence, Judge Wilson kept a steady conversation flowing. How long have you both been working here? He asked. 3 weeks, sir, Officer Stevens replied. The taller officer seemed more relaxed now, though still clearly uncomfortable. 2.5 weeks for me, Officer Burrows added. We were hired together with the new security upgrades. Judge Wilson nodded thoughtfully. Did your training include information about the judges who work in this building? The officers exchanged glances before Officer Stevens admitted. We were given a general orientation, but no specific introductions. By the time they reached Judge Wilson's chambers, news of the incident had already reached his assistant, Maria. She stood at the door with concern written across her face. Judge, I heard what happened. Should I call someone? She asked, eyeing the officers suspiciously. No need, Maria. Officers Stevens and Burrows will be observing court today, Judge Wilson explained, his tone making it clear this wasn't a punishment but an opportunity. Could you please bring 3 copies of today's docket when you have a moment? Inside his chambers, Judge Wilson invited the officers to sit while he removed his coat and put on his judicial robe. The walls were lined with law books, family photos, and a framed copy of the Constitution. A carved wooden sign on his desk read, Justice sees with the heart as well as the eyes. My father gave me that when I was appointed to the bench, Judge Wilson said, noticing Officer Burrows looking at it. He didn't live to see me become a judge, but he always believed I would. The younger officer nodded, a flash of something like understanding crossing his face. Today's case involves 6 families whose properties border a disputed piece of land, Judge Wilson explained, pulling out a folder. What makes it interesting is that these families have been neighbors for generations, yet this issue has divided them deeply. What's your job in a case like that? Officer Stevens asked, seeming genuinely curious. To listen, to apply the law fairly, and sometimes, to help people see beyond the immediate conflict to the community they'll still share after my ruling, Judge Wilson answered. Maria entered with the docket copies and handed them out. Court starts in 10 minutes, Judge, and Chief Judge Hernandez called. He wants to speak with you about this morning's incident. Judge Wilson smiled. Please tell him we'll talk after today's session. I think I'll have something valuable to report by then. As they prepared to enter the courtroom, Judge Wilson paused and turned to the officers. I could have responded differently this morning, he said quietly. I could have demanded entry, called for your supervisor, or made a formal complaint. The officers shifted nervously. But what would that have accomplished? Judge Wilson continued. More division, more misunderstanding. Instead, I'd like us to learn from each other today. Officer Burrows, who had been mostly silent, finally spoke up. Sir, I want to apologize. We should have handled that differently. Judge Wilson nodded. Apology accepted. But today isn't just about what happened at that door. It's about what happens next. As they entered the courtroom through the judge's private entrance, a hush fell over the crowd. Everyone rose as Judge Wilson took his seat at the bench. The officers stood uncertainly until he motioned them to chairs positioned where they could observe the proceedings. All rise. The Honorable Judge Marcus Wilson presiding in the case of Henderson et al. Versus Blackwood Properties, the bailiff announced. Judge Wilson surveyed the courtroom, the nervous families, the eager attorneys, and now, 2 security officers getting their first real glimpse of justice in action. What none of them knew was that before the day ended, a simple courthouse incident would transform into something much more significant. Court is now in session, Judge Wilson declared, his voice carrying the weight of both authority and compassion. The next few hours would prove to be eye-opening for everyone present. The land dispute case moved forward with Judge Wilson guiding the proceedings with practiced ease. From their seats, Officers Stevens and Burrows watched as families who had been neighbors for generations argued over property lines and access rights. Mr. Henderson, while I understand your frustration, please address your comments to the court, not directly to Mr. Blackwood. Judge Wilson said calmly when tensions rose between the main parties. During a brief recess, Judge Wilson invited the officers to his chambers. What are your observations so far? He asked them, removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. Officer Stevens spoke first. I didn't realize how emotional these cases get. That older woman was nearly in tears when talking about the oak tree. Mrs. Henderson, Judge Wilson nodded. That tree was planted by her grandfather. To her, it's not just property, it's heritage. Officer Burrows leaned forward in his chair. I noticed how you speak to everyone the same way, whether they're the fancy lawyer or the farmer in overalls. Judge Wilson smiled slightly. Everyone deserves the same respect in my courtroom. Justice isn't just about the outcome, it's about how we get there. A knock at the door interrupted them. Maria poked her head in. Judge, Chief Judge Hernandez is here. He insists on speaking with you now. Judge Wilson nodded. Please ask him to join us. Chief Judge Hernandez, a tall man with silver hair and a serious expression, entered the room. His eyebrows rose when he saw the 2 officers. Marcus, I heard about this morning's incident, he began, his voice tight with controlled anger. These officers have been reported for. Judge Wilson raised a hand. Richard, please. I've invited Officers Stevens and Burrows to observe court today. We've been having a productive conversation. The Chief Judge looked bewildered. You can't be serious. They denied you entry to your own courthouse. They did, Judge Wilson acknowledged. And now they're seeing firsthand what that delay means for the people in my courtroom. Officer Stevens stood up. Sir, it was a mistake. We should have. It wasn't just a mistake, Judge Hernandez interrupted. It was a failure of training, a protocol, and of basic respect. Judge Wilson gestured for everyone to sit down. Richard, when I was a young attorney, my mentor told me something I've never forgotten. He said, the law can punish, but only people can teach. A silence fell over the room. These officers are 3 weeks into their jobs, Judge Wilson continued. They could be sent to sensitivity training, they could be reprimanded, or even fired. Or they could learn from real experience what justice means in practice. Officer Burrows, who had been quiet, suddenly spoke up. My grandfather was a sharecropper in Georgia, he said, his voice low. He told me stories about not being allowed places because of how he looked. This morning, I did to you what was done to him. I don't know how I missed that. The room grew silent again, but this time the silence held something different. Understanding beginning to take root. Chief Judge Hernandez looked at Officer Burrows for a long moment, then turned to Judge Wilson. What do you propose? Let them complete today's observation. Then, I suggest we develop a proper introduction program for all courthouse security. Every officer should know every judge, every clerk, every regular attorney, not just by face, but by role and contribution. Officer Stevens nodded eagerly. We could also use better training on the difference between security protocols and unnecessary barriers. Judge Hernandez considered this, then slowly nodded. I'll support your approach, Marcus, but I want a formal report and recommendation by the end of the week. As they prepared to return to the courtroom, Judge Wilson stopped at the door. Justice isn't just rendered in verdicts, he said quietly. Sometimes it's built in moments like these. The afternoon session was about to begin, but the most important case of the day wasn't the land dispute. It was the transformation happening in the hearts and minds of two officers who had come face to face with the consequences of their actions, and a judge who chose education over humiliation. The afternoon session of court resumed with renewed focus. Judge Wilson called the parties back to order, but something had shifted in the courtroom atmosphere. The officers, now sitting with greater attention, seemed to absorb every word and gesture. Your Honor, said Mr. Blackwood's attorney, a young woman named Ms. Reed, my client would like to propose a compromise regarding the eastern boundary of the property. Judge Wilson nodded. The court is always encouraged when parties seek compromise. Please proceed. As the attorneys presented their modified proposals, Officer Stevens watched the judge's methodical approach. He noticed how Judge Wilson asked clarifying questions, how he gave each side equal time to speak, and how he showed no favoritism despite the obvious difference in wealth between the Blackwood family and the Hendersons. During one particularly tense exchange, Mrs. Henderson stood up without being recognized. That land has been in my family for 4 generations, she exclaimed, her voice breaking. How can you put a price on that? Before the bailiff could intervene, Judge Wilson raised his hand gently. Mrs. Henderson, he said, his voice firm but kind, I understand this is deeply personal for you. I'm listening to everything you're saying, but in this courtroom, we have procedures that ensure everyone is heard. Please allow your attorney to speak on your behalf, or I'll give you a proper opportunity to address the court. The woman nodded and sat down, visibly calmed by his response. Officer Burrows leaned slightly toward Officer Stevens and whispered. He treated her with dignity even when she broke the rules. The session continued for another hour before Judge Wilson called for another short recess. During this break, an unexpected visitor appeared in the judge's chambers, Samuel Johnson, a 24-year-old black law clerk who had witnessed the morning's incident. Your Honor, Samuel said after being invited in, I wanted to speak with you about what happened this morning. Judge Wilson gestured for him to continue. I've been stopped by security 3 times since I started working here 2 months ago, Samuel explained, his voice quiet but determined. I wear my ID badge. I dress professionally, but I'm still asked to justify my presence. The officers, still present in the chambers, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Judge Wilson nodded slowly. Thank you for sharing that, Samuel. It takes courage to speak up. He turned to the officers. This is why today matters. It's not just about one incident. It's about a pattern that affects people's dignity and their ability to do their jobs. Officer Stevens looked directly at Samuel. I'm sorry that happened to you. I never thought about how these security checks might feel when they only seem to happen to certain people. Judge Wilson observed this exchange with quiet approval. Samuel, would you be willing to help us develop that introduction program we discussed earlier? Your perspective would be valuable. The young clerk straightened his shoulders. I'd be honored, Judge Wilson. As Samuel left, Maria entered with a message. Judge, the parties are asking if they could have 1 more hour to discuss a potential settlement. They think they might be able to resolve this without further court time. Judge Wilson smiled. That's excellent news. Tell them they can use conference room B, and we'll reconvene at 3:30. After Maria left, Judge Wilson turned to the officers. You see, sometimes the most important thing a judge can do is give people time and space to find their own solutions. Officer Burrows nodded thoughtfully. I never thought about courts this way. I always pictured judges just handing down verdicts. Justice is a conversation, not a declaration, Judge Wilson replied. Much like what we're doing right now. The three men continued their discussion, touching on security protocols, implicit bias, and the balance between safety and accessibility. What had begun as a tense confrontation was evolving into something unexpected, a bridge of understanding being built word by word, insight by insight. When they returned to the courtroom at 3:30, the attorneys approached the bench with news that would bring this day full circle in a way none of them could have anticipated. Your Honor, Ms. Reed addressed Judge Wilson as court reconvened. The parties have reached a settlement agreement. A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. Judge Wilson nodded, careful to keep his expression neutral despite his pleasure at this development. That's commendable news. Would you like to present the terms to the court? He asked. Mr. Henderson's attorney, a seasoned lawyer named Mr. Washington, stepped forward. With your Honor's permission, the parties would like to present this together. What followed surprised everyone in the courtroom. Mr. Blackwood, the wealthy property developer, and Mr. Henderson, the third-generation farmer, stood side by side at the podium. Your Honor, Mr. Blackwood began, our families have been neighbors for over 70 years. This dispute has damaged relationships that should matter more than property lines. Mr. Henderson nodded in agreement. We've created a solution that honors both families' connections to the land. That oak tree Mrs. Henderson's grandfather planted will remain accessible to both families, with a small memorial plaque acknowledging its history. Judge Wilson listened as they outlined the rest of their agreement: shared access to the disputed creek, adjustments to the property line that benefited both parties, and a joint commitment to maintain the rural character of the area. From their seats, Officers Stevens and Burrows watched the transformation unfold. What had seemed like bitter enemies that morning were now shaking hands, their attorneys exchanging relieved smiles. All this came from giving them time to talk to each other. Officer Stevens whispered. Judge Wilson, overhearing the comment, addressed the court once he had reviewed the settlement agreement. The court approves this settlement and commends all parties for their willingness to find common ground. Before we conclude today's proceedings, I'd like to share an observation. The courtroom fell silent. This morning, before court began, I experienced a situation at the courthouse entrance that could have escalated into conflict. Instead, it became an opportunity for understanding. I see the same wisdom in what you've accomplished today, choosing conversation over confrontation. Mr. Henderson, a man of few words, spoke up. Sometimes people just need to be reminded they're neighbors first and disputants second, Your Honor. As court adjourned, Judge Wilson invited the attorneys and parties back to his chambers, along with the two officers. Once everyone was settled, he asked a question that took them all by surprise. Would you mind sharing what happened during your discussion? What turned adversaries into partners? Mrs. Henderson, who had been emotional earlier, answered first. Mr. Blackwood shared that his father used to fish in that creek with my late husband. I had no idea they knew each other that way. Mr. Blackwood nodded. And when Mrs. Henderson explained about the oak tree being planted when our first child was born, a child they later lost, I couldn't imagine separating her from that memory. Judge Wilson turned to the officers. Gentlemen, this is why context matters. When we see only what's on the surface, property lines or ID badges, we miss the deeper human stories. As the parties left, Officer Burrows lingered behind. Judge Wilson, I have a question that's been bothering me all day. Go ahead, Judge Wilson encouraged. Why didn't you just pull rank this morning? You could have demanded entry or reported us immediately. Most people in your position would have. Judge Wilson considered the question carefully, because punishing someone doesn't necessarily teach them, and sometimes the person with the most power has the greatest responsibility to seek understanding rather than victory. The day was drawing to a close. Court staff were gathering their things, and the afternoon sunlight slanted through the high windows of the courthouse. What had begun as a confrontation had transformed into something none of them had expected, a day of healing, not just for the families in dispute, but for the very system of justice itself. As Officer Burrows left the chambers, he paused at the door. "I won't forget today, Judge. Not ever." Word of what happened spread through the courthouse like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone from janitors to senior judges had heard about Judge Wilson's unusual response to being denied entry. As he walked into the building, he noticed the difference immediately. Security officers greeted him by name, court staff nodded with newfound respect, and several attorneys went out of their way to say good morning. Chief Judge Hernandez called a meeting of all judges and security personnel for 9:00 a.m. The large conference room was packed, with Officers Stevens and Burrows seated nervously in the front row. "I've asked you all here to address what happened yesterday," Chief Judge Hernandez began, his voice serious, "but also to discuss the positive changes that will come from it." All eyes turned to Judge Wilson as he stood to speak. "Thank you all for coming. Yesterday could have been just another story about discrimination in our justice system. Instead, I hope it becomes a story about transformation." He made eye contact with Officers Stevens and Burrows before continuing. "These officers made a mistake, a serious one, but their willingness to learn from it has been remarkable." Officer Stevens stood up, his posture straight, but his expression humble. "Judge Wilson could have had us fired," he said, addressing the room. "Instead, he showed us what justice really looks like. It's not just about following rules, it's about seeing the humanity in everyone who walks through these doors." Officer Burrows added, "We drafted some suggestions for improving security protocols without creating barriers. We'd like to present them as part of this discussion." Samuel Johnson, the young law clerk who had shared his own experiences, stepped forward with a folder. "I've worked with Officers Stevens and Burrows to develop an introduction program," he explained. "Every security officer will meet every judge, clerk, and regular court staff member. We'll have photos and bios posted in the security office. But most importantly, we'll have conversations, real ones, about why we're all here." Judge Wilson watched with quiet pride as the discussion unfolded. Security officers shared their concerns about doing their jobs effectively while avoiding bias. Judges and attorneys offered perspectives on access to justice. Court staff suggested practical improvements to ID systems and entry procedures. During a break, Maria approached Judge Wilson with a stack of messages. "The press has been calling all morning," she said. "They heard about what happened and want interviews." Judge Wilson shook his head. "This isn't about publicity. It's about making real change in our courthouse." As the meeting resumed, Chief Judge Hernandez unveiled a new courthouse initiative called Justice Seen, Justice Served. It would include training for all staff on implicit bias, regular community dialogues, and a mentoring program pairing experienced court personnel with newcomers. "Judge Wilson has shown us that true leadership isn't about asserting authority," the Chief Judge said. "It's about transforming challenges into opportunities for growth." At the end of the meeting, Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Blackwood made a surprise appearance. They had returned to the courthouse together to file their settlement agreement officially. "We heard about what happened to you, Judge," Mrs. Henderson said. "It reminded me of something my grandfather used to say. How you handle unfairness shows more about you than how you handle praise." As everyone began to leave, Officer Burrows approached Judge Wilson with a question. "Sir, there's something I still don't understand. When you had every right to be angry, you chose patience instead. How?" Judge Wilson considered the question carefully. "My father was denied jobs because of his color. My mother couldn't enter certain stores. They could have taught me bitterness, but they chose to teach me dignity instead." He placed a hand on the young officer's shoulder. "Sometimes, the most powerful response to disrespect isn't anger. It's excellence. It's showing through your actions what others fail to see." As they walked together toward Courtroom C, where a new day of cases awaited, Judge Wilson knew that something significant had shifted in the courthouse. A moment of injustice had been transformed into a catalyst for change, proving that sometimes the most shocking response is the one that chooses understanding over outrage. 1 year later, Lincoln County Courthouse looked much the same from the outside. The same stone steps led to the same heavy doors. But inside, subtle yet meaningful changes were evident everywhere. A wall near the security checkpoint displayed photos of all courthouse staff, judges, clerks, attorneys, and security officers. Visitors noticed the easy familiarity between security personnel and everyone who entered. Officer Stevens, now promoted to head of courthouse security, greeted Judge Wilson with a warm handshake as he arrived. "Good morning, Judge. Big day today." Judge Wilson nodded, smiling. 1 year in the making. Today marked the official launch of the courthouse's community justice program, inspired by the events of that fateful morning a year ago. What had begun as a confrontation had evolved into a model program being adopted by courthouses across the state. In the main conference room, journalists, community leaders, and legal professionals gathered for the presentation. Officer Burrows, looking confident in his uniform, helped to direct visitors to their seats. "Hard to believe it's been a year since I almost ruined my career before it started," he said quietly to Judge Wilson as they passed each other. "Or began it properly," Judge Wilson replied. "Sometimes our best work comes after our biggest mistakes." Chief Judge Hernandez opened the proceedings with a brief history of what had happened and the changes that followed. Then he introduced the team who had made it all possible: Judge Wilson, Officers Stevens and Burrows, Samuel Johnson, now a full-time program coordinator, and others who had contributed to the transformation. Judge Wilson took the podium to explain the program's components. "The Community Justice Program has 3 pillars," he began. "First, recognition, ensuring that everyone who works in or visits our courthouse is seen as a person first, not just a role or a case number. Second, education, ongoing training about bias, justice, and community needs. And third, connection, creating meaningful relationships between the justice system and the community it serves." As he spoke, screens displayed the program's impressive first-year results. Complaints about security procedures down by 78%, increased diversity in courthouse hiring, and higher satisfaction ratings from both employees and visitors. Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Blackwood sat side by side in the audience. Their property dispute settlement had blossomed into a community garden project on the once disputed land, with local schoolchildren learning about farming and conservation. "Our courthouse is not just a building where legal matters are decided," Judge Wilson continued. "It's a place where justice must be experienced by everyone who enters. That means being treated with dignity from the moment you approach our doors." After the presentation, a young security officer approached Judge Wilson. She had been hired as part of the expanded security team 6 months earlier. "Judge Wilson, I wanted to thank you," she said. "My training under Officers Stevens and Burrows taught me that security isn't just about protecting a building. It's about protecting what the building stands for." As the day's events wound down, Judge Wilson found a quiet moment alone in his chambers. On his desk sat a framed photograph from the morning that changed everything. A picture someone had snapped of him standing outside the courthouse with the 2 officers. It reminded him daily that justice wasn't just declared from the bench. It was built in small moments of choice. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. It was Samuel, holding a letter. "Judge, we just received this from the National Judicial Conference. They want to implement our program nationwide." Judge Wilson took the letter, thinking about how far they had come and how much further there was to go. "You know, Samuel," he said, "my father used to tell me that real change doesn't happen when powerful people make speeches. It happens when ordinary people make extraordinary choices in difficult moments." As they walked together through the courthouse hallways, Judge Wilson saw not just a building transformed, but people transformed by the simple yet profound recognition that justice begins with seeing the humanity in each person, even when, especially when, they fail to see it in you.